In today's Elden Ring video, we'll take a look at the best and worst sorceries and rank them. We'll try to factor in everything including damage, efficiency, ease of use and so on, and I will rank all of these spells from D tier all the way to S tier, where of course the max tier is reserved for truly powerful boss melting spells, A for sorceries that are super strong, can really damage bosses but are just not there yet to the top, B for solid all around choices, and from this point on just mediocre or bad all-around choices. So let's begin. Let's begin with the Great Glintstone Shard. After all of the pebbles, comets and shards, and especially after the recent update damage and FP buffs to this sorcery, I found this one to be the best all-arounder projectile for most mage setups. Damage to mana efficiency is just slightly worse than the pebble, but provides a lot more benefits, including the fact that it deals about 40% more damage than the pebble, so comes in very handy later on in the game against tougher enemies. It travels just a bit slower than the pebble, but has a significantly higher range, which means you can reach targets from way further away, even those that are supposed to trap you. And if you get a Primal Glintstone Talisman, you can also further reduce its FP cost and bring it down to a measly 9 FP, which is amazing. There's not many downsides to it, outside of the fact that it's not really a boss melter, just a really good option, which is why I'm going to give it a B+. At number 2 we have the Rock Sling, and by far my favorite sorcery to use as a mage early on, because you can create one of the most powerful setups right off the bat between just this and the Meteorite staff. It also remains one of the most useful sorceries way into the end game while still providing great damage. And speaking of damage, it's purely physical instead of magical, so you don't have to, well, worry about enemies with natural magic resistances. It also has a great range, but most important, it's one of the best early spells to stun enemies or bosses in just a couple of casts, so definitely something that doesn't lose its usefulness when you go into the end game. That being said, it does feature some downsides, the most important being the fact that if you're too close to the enemy, or even more so if you're in very tight spaces, this is literally one of the worst spells to cast in that scenario. If you lose even one of the 3 summoned rocks, if they don't hit the target or if they get wasted on some kind of obstacle, that means wasting a huge chunk of damage. Verdict, pretty much A. Despite all of these problems, you can more than make up for some of these downsides by simply having a proper positioning. Coming up to number 3 and 4, there's gonna be 2 spells we're gonna talk about since they are so similar to one another, including the Rancorcall and the Ancient Death Rancorcall, the more improved version of the first one. I'm still holding on the belief that one day From Software will buff these death sorceries, but as it stands, these are some of the weakest right now in the game alongside the Thorn sorceries. This doesn't mean there aren't some benefits to them, especially to the Death Rancorcall. The projectile, especially on the more improved version, have a pretty good tracking and are really hard to dodge. The fact that you cast so many of these spirits in one single spell make it quite overwhelming. It can be especially so both in PvP and PvE, since you're gonna be able to easily stun a lot of the bosses in the game. It's just a shame that these spells have so many weaknesses. The fact that the damage on both of the spells is completely underwhelming at best, even when I build specifically towards buffing them as much as possible. The spirits that you summon also travel very slow. Even though they have a good tracking, there's a possibility for them to completely miss if the target just charges at you. The cost is also really high for both of them, 16 FP and 24 FP respectively, making them not the greatest in terms of efficiency. So the final verdict is D for the normal Rancorcall and C for the Ancient variant. To make them more viable, I think that the normal variant should be brought up to the same damage that the Ancient one does, and yeah, the Ancient one should get about a 30% more in terms of damage, and that would place them way higher on the list. Now, the 5th sorcery, called Adula's Moonblade, was definitely a nice surprise and definitely deserving of an A+ ranking. It's by far the best sweeping Carian slash that I found personally, even compared to some of the other slices or similar options that for me just feel like they fell off too hard against later game enemies. This one also covers a long range, as the main attack is also followed by a frost projectile that covers a very wide range. It only costs 28 FP to cast and requires 32 intelligence to use, so it's kind of like in the middle in terms of efficiency. By far its biggest hidden advantage is the fact that the frost projectile can hit the same target multiple times as it passes through it. Even some of the smaller enemies get hit at least a couple of times, and especially against some of the bigger bosses like the dragons, you can hit it at the same time with just one projectile up to 3 times. So that builds a ton of damage, a ton of frostbite really quickly, and can literally apply it for thousands of damage in just a little bit, which is why I put it to A+. At number 6, there's no ranking to speak of without also including the Comet Azur, which is still by far the DPS king of Elden Ring, and there's very few spells in the game that even get close to its maximum damage potential. Its massive intelligence requirement of 60 and massive FP cost of 40 isn't really a deterrent, since you can use a Cerulean Physic Potion to simply get infinite mana for about 15 seconds. Assuming that you can line up all of the buffs and the enemy without missing the spell, this will trivialize everything in the game, including the Elden Beast, and literally get melted in just mere seconds. Now, there are some downsides to it still, one of the most important being the fact that there's gonna be a pretty big setup and preparation required to fully maximize the damage, but if you are at least level like 80 to 100, that should not be a problem. Most important though, the beam tracking is quite iffy, if not quite bad. Any slight change in elevation, a wrong angle, or just the boss moving out of the way means you're literally not hitting it and not dealing any damage at all, so you're kinda wasting the entire setup. Despite all of these problems, it's still a god tier spell to have, which is why it's going to be right there at the top. Moving on to number 7, let's talk about some other top tier spells, including the Meteorite and the Meteorite of Astel. These two spells kind of function very similarly, one being the Meteorite, and then there is also the Astel variant that summons even more rocks with even more precision, or well, better yet, to just hit targets easier with it. These are the embodiment of From Software's coolness to downside ratio, as in, on one side, the spells are extremely flashy and cool looking when you summon an entire belt of asteroids against your enemies, but the range is pretty bad, and even more so, the accuracy is, well, just a letdown, since you're likely not going to hit much with the Meteorite unless you're hugging it. So that's why I'm gonna place the Meteorite as just a B ranking right off the bat, maybe a B+ if you hug the enemy, but the Meteorite of Astel definitely deserves an S ranking. Why, you might ask? Well, because if you use the same setup as the Comet Azur, or if you follow this up after the enemy has been stunned, it can deal way more damage even compared to the Comet Azur, but assuming that you're fighting against a boss that is very large and you can get all of the projectiles to hit. Even though you aren't going to hit with all of them, it's still great at providing additional stagger in case enemies get close to you, so you can then, well, just remain stationary and deal that damage. But moving on to number 9 and 10, let's talk about two spells called Briars of Sin and Briars of Punishment, the only two Thorn sorceries in Elden Ring, but they definitely win a lot of points into the cool factor. Now, to get everything out of them, to squeeze as much damage as possible and usefulness, I've given them everything in terms of bonus damage. I've used the Albric set and the Staff of the Guilty to increase his damage by at least another 50%, and I've also used the Staff of Lucette in the main hand to buff all sorceries, Briars included, and these two still felt underwhelming. So I'm gonna start with the strengths just so I don't completely ruin them, but in terms of the Briars of Punishment, this one is slightly more useful since you can cast a Trail of Thorns that covers a pretty long range and also deals okay-ish damage. Even more so, it seems to pass through obstacles and are definitely amazing against enemies on higher elevations when other spells might have trouble with that. Meanwhile, the Briars of Sin can do all of that, but only in a very close AoE range around your character, and of course, the more you summon these and subsequent attacks, they're gonna have an even faster cast than the initial one. That being said, despite all of these cool factors, these are some really weak sorceries desperately in need of a major buff, just like the Rancorcall spells. The wind-up, especially on the Briars of Sin, is very long, even if the following casts are shorter, and it's too much of a sacrifice for the type of damage that you're gonna be dealing when there's other spells that have way less costs and way less detriments at the same level. You even have to sacrifice a portion of your HP with each cast, and you can totally die by your own spell if you're not being careful. For now, I'm really sad to place the Briars of Sin in the D tier and the Briars of Punishment in the C tier, maybe a C+ for the punishment. It could definitely jump into B with just a small little buff from Software. Moving on to number 11, another couple of 2 spells. We have Oracular Bubbles and the Great Oracular Bubbles. These are the only 2 claimant sorceries, and I can see why they both actually suck. Especially the regular bubbles, just straight up D, and I kind of wish that I made an E category just for this because it feels like this is the weakest spell right now in all Elden Ring. These bubbles look like they are made for a trap kind of spell, but it doesn't travel too long, it lingers for very little, and the damage is mediocre at best. Even misses large enemies at close range because of the odd bubble spread, so definitely deserving of the D tier right there at the end. Meanwhile, the Great Oracular Bubble is just slightly better than it, dealing higher damage but comes at 2 great drawbacks that are simply too important to overlook. The fact that it's a very slow cast speed, probably the lowest right now in the entire game, even when you put something like a seal on it, and a very slow travel speed, kind of offsetting by the long reach, I guess, but it's still super weak. So the verdict, D for the first one, C for the greater version. Coming up next, we have 3 fire-related sorceries that can fit a pyromancer that doesn't want to spec into faith at all, and this includes the Magma Shot, the Rolling Magma, and finally Gelmir's Fury. That being said, the Magma spells are surprisingly good at what they do, assuming that you play by their strengths. So the Rolling Magma in particular has, it seems, the highest damage potential when aimed at the ground and not directly at the enemy. Aiming it at the ground will cause a magma explosion after a rather long duration at the point of impact, dealing really high damage if the enemy is still in range. Even aimed directly at the enemy still deals some pretty okay damage, but obviously you will want to have that explosion part to deal the highest amount of damage. Meanwhile, the Magma Shot is the more straightforward version of all of these magma spells, as in it does straight up damage, no gimmicks, it explodes on impact, and also leaves a trail of magma for additional damage, which is actually quite handy and will definitely deal up to 2k if you're doing it properly. Finally, the Gelmir's Fury, this is the weakest, not because it lacks damage per projectile, far from that, but because of the fact that it covers a 360-degree area from the top of your scepters. So this literally means that you will miss at least like 40% of the shots that you're taking. You kinda either have to be completely surrounded by enemies or inside of them, which is rarely possible in this game. Final verdict for these, both the Rolling Magma and the Magma Shot definitely deserve a B, maybe even a B+ for the Rolling Magma. Meanwhile, if we were to go for the Gelmir's Fury, I'm gonna just place it over at C. I would not place it any higher than that, simply because it's too gimmicky. Now moving on to 16, we have 3 more spells that are very similar to one another. So these are the Phalanx spells, including the Glintstone, Carian, and the Greatblade Phalanx. They all function pretty similarly, but they kind of focus on different aspects of, well, combat. The Glintblade Phalanx is the earliest, kind of has medium damage, and is pretty much meant as a pressure tool, either used in conjunction with other spells or when trying to make your escape or when the enemy is trying to roll away. It's pretty good at catching rolls. The Carian Phalanx is the upgraded version of this, as in it summons even more swords and deals roughly 30% more damage, but at a 30% more mana cost. Finally, the Greatblade Phalanx has just slightly lower damage than the Carian version depending on the enemy, but also has a lot more stance damage, as in between these spells is the only one that I tested that is able to stun enemies at a decent rate. So the strengths, yeah, great at putting pressure on enemies, providing extra bit of damage, in PvP can help at roll catching enemies, and the Greatblade Phalanx can also do some stagger. In terms of weaknesses, obviously hitting any wall or obstacle will destroy the swords, which means losing a ton of damage, and most important, the Ash of War variant of the Glintblade Phalanx is just a better version of all of these combined. It still provides some damage, but it only takes 2 hits to stagger anything in the game. Not sure if that one is broken, not sure if that's gonna change in the future, but as it stands, the Ash of War is just a way better, less mana consumption version of all of these combined. So verdict, finally, B across the line, maybe B- for all of them. and I would even put them in C if I were to judge them just by their damage, but because you don't use them just for pure DPS, they also have some utility. It deserves a B- right there. Now the number 19 spell is another devastating sorcery, high intelligence requirement at 43 and a much more improved FP cost after the new update, just 38 by default, and that's gonna be the Stars of Ruin. That being said, coupled with a Staff of Lucette and some magic bonus talismans, this thing will wreck anything. PvE wise, it has a pretty great cast speed considering it unleashes 12 almost instantaneous magic bullets at extremely high speeds. It's not going to get anywhere near the Comet Azur in terms of pure DPS, but it wins more in terms of mobility and enemy tracking. PvP wise, it's just pure cancer unless you have a Bloodhound Step or Magic Reflect Shield to bypass or counter these. I think it's possible to dodge roll some of the projectiles, but not all of them, so you're not going to remain undamaged when you're trying to dodge these alone. In terms of weaknesses, maybe the initial cast duration, which can be interrupted, is pretty long, so that's one of them. Also the fact that the spell can easily be reflected, and once like you see the enemy popping it, it's super easy to anticipate. But despite all of this, it's still definitely an S rating category, not like the top of the category, but definitely up there as a boss melter and a huge potential in damage. Coming up to number 20, we left quite a number of very powerful max tier spells towards the end of the video, but the Crystal Torrent is another very similar stream of damage, kinda close to Comet Azur, except instead of one beam you shoot a stream of crystals with a large spread towards the end, but at a lower reach. That being said, this reaches very comparable damage to the aforementioned spell with just a couple of extra steps. Its advantage consists in its spread, not only being able to cover a much larger area and hitting multiple targets in case they are kind of close to one another, but if you aim the target before unleashing it with your character will then readjust the trajectory of the spell, meaning that you won't suffer the same consequences as Comet Azur to miss out your beam entirely in case the boss moves. Given the fact that this is the slightly earlier, lower intelligence requirement than Comet Azur, it literally makes it its smaller brother. It also gets buffed by Crystalline Staff, by the way. I forgot to mention that this also works for the Stars of Ruin. Pretty much any kind of like crystal spell gets buffed by it, so you can apply another 30% damage on top, which brings it almost on par to Comet Azur. No real downsides of the ones that we already stated in the previous spells, maybe except the fact that it has a slightly lower reach, but again, straight up S category right there before Comet Azur, making a ton of damage possible. Coming up to number 21 and 22, we have Crystal Release and Magic Downpour. Both provide a vertical sort of release of magic bullets, but they work slightly differently. I really wanted to like these two because they genuinely deal a lot of damage if you can align all of the shots, but that's not going to happen. Magic Downpour is the more useful one as it can zone out enemies. I think that this would be better in PvP, honestly. It provides a pretty good distraction or a way to put pressure on the enemy, especially since you can cast multiple pretty fast and they all hone in on the target. They even readjust where they shoot with those bullets. Even if the target is upwards or starts flying in the air, it will readjust its trajectory mid-combat, but obviously the bullets themselves won't, so you will miss with quite a lot of them. Meanwhile, the Crystal Release is, well, literally godlike if it didn't have one major downside holding it back, and that is the fact that it's probably the smallest range of all spells right now in Elden Ring, maybe with a few exceptions. So this means you're not going to be able to hit unless there's a huge, well, hitbox and you're pretty much almost inside of it, because you're kind of casting a cone, so to speak, of bullets that deal damage just slightly around your character. So it's not really viable in any of the situations that I found. You're also stuck in that animation, so for that reason, yeah, the Crystal Release falls in the C category. Meanwhile, the Magic Downpour is a solid B. Well, could be an A really if it had more honing on it, or if it had bullets that hit in a more concentrated area so you can align it with the boss. And with that out of the way, these are pretty much all of the best and worst spells in Elden Ring. Obviously there's still quite a few options left in terms of sorceries, but they usually follow, yeah, just in the tracks of the other outliers that we've talked about in today's video. And besides Besides, I didn't want to make like the video half an hour long or more to go over every single one of them. So if that's gonna be necessary, I'm gonna cover them in different videos, but this is right now the ranking for sorceries. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.